police officer hastily judged, mistaking the FBI agent on duty for a dangerous individual simply because he wasn't in a fateful moment, a false assumption, without asking, without listening, ruined the operation and potentially closed the door on his own career. The FBI agent coldly remarked, "Next time you'll do better, but will you?" Let's dive into the gripping story of the cost of haste and the costly lesson of mistaken assumptions. Officer Trent David moved through the aisles of Hensley's Market with clear purpose, the weight of his uniform pressing against him as it had every day for years. The subtle shift in his posture was a constant reminder. He was always on duty. He didn't need calls or reports, not today. The day was nearly over, and all he wanted was a quick stop, a protein bar, maybe a pack of beer for the night. He deserved it. It had been a long, tiring shift, but the routine was simple, familiar. Walk through the aisles, mind his own business, and leave. As he passed the bread section, a slight movement caught his eye. A man stood near the dairy counter, tall, likely in his mid-sessors. His athletic build stood out among the ordinary shoppers, but it wasn't his physique that drew David's attention. It was the stillness and unsettling calm of someone who didn't seem to belong to the flow of everyday life. The man's eyes flicked toward him. Just a glance, but enough for David to sense something was off, and his instincts kicked in with the authority of someone who had seen it all. Or so he thought. He straightened, took a few purposeful steps, and approached with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned. "You work store security?" he asked, his voice firm, commanding. The man didn't flinch. He simply raised his eyes slowly, calm and composed. "No," he replied, not angrily but firmly. David didn't like that. Something about the man's calm, his confidence, tightened the officer's chest with irritation. "You've been watching people for a while," David pressed, not pausing to weigh his words. "You planning to buy anything?" The stranger raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something in his gaze that David couldn't place. Not anger, amusement, perhaps. "I was on the phone," he said softly, his voice cutting through the rising tension between them. "Just asking," David shot back, his words sharper than intended. "And I don't like being lied to." Behind them, the sound of shopping carts and metal clinking against tile seemed to slow, as if the store was holding its breath. A woman stacking apples paused. A child whispered to their mother. David was no longer just a shopper. In his mind, he was a figure of authority, and the scene had shifted. His chest puffed out slightly, his steps more assertive, his voice louder. This wasn't just a question anymore. It was about control. The man didn't move. His hands remained visible, calm. Too calm. "My name is James Smith," he said slowly, pulling something from his back pocket. "Agent, FBI." David felt a flicker of doubt. He didn't buy it, not for a second. "Let me see that badge," he ordered, his hand already drifting toward his belt. His fingers grazed the edge of his holster as he stepped closer. Towering over the man, James didn't blink. He pulled out the badge, opening it with deliberate slowness. David barely glanced at it, his eyes not even reading the text before waving it off dismissively. "Anyone can carry a fake badge," he muttered. The tension grew palpable. James's gaze met David's with a quiet intensity, the weight of silence pressing down on the officer. "You need to step back," James said, his voice calm but laced with undeniable steel. David bristled, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being dismissed, not like this, not in front of a store full of people. He glanced around. The woman with the apples, the child with their mother. They were all watching now, waiting to see if the officer would back down or press forward. "You're interfering with a federal operation," James added, his voice resolute. "You're about to ruin a case we've been building for 6 months. Those words hit David harder than anything he'd expected. His eyes narrowed, his breath quickening. "You should have notified someone. That local PD would check on a guy loitering around the yogurt aisle," he snapped. "Looks suspicious." "I'm not obligated to notify you," James replied, his gaze unwavering. This is federal jurisdiction. Step back. David's hand twitched, his fingers itching to grab his notepad. He needed to regain control. His voice lowered, now cold. If you don't have proof, or someone I can call, I'm detaining you right here. James didn't move, didn't blink, showed no fear. His body was a silent testament to something David couldn't grasp. You sure you want to go that route? James asked, his voice still calm, unshaken. David stared at him, his chest tight, the air between them heavy with judgment and ego. The crowd around them had shifted. What was once a quiet shopping trip now felt like a stage, a moment frozen in time, teetering between control and chaos. And yet it wasn't David in control. Suddenly another presence emerged, a woman, shorter than James but radiating a commanding aura. Sharp eyes, poised posture, everything about her exuded authority, precision. Agent Chloe Sullivan didn't speak immediately. She simply stepped between them, cutting through the tension with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. David blinked. She hadn't been there a second ago. He hadn't seen her approach. Her voice was low, purposeful, almost surgical. "Officer, you're interfering with a federal operation. You need to step back." David's eyes flicked to her badge, then back to James. He wasn't done yet. "And who are you?" Chloe's response was swift, her tone cold and resolute. "Agent Chloe, I'm James's colleague." "You've disrupted our surveillance," David scoffed, disbelief plain on his face. "2 FBI agents, no coordination with local PD, no clear suspect. And you expect me to believe you're just shopping for justice?" Chloe didn't blink. Her eyes held his, her posture unmoving. "No, officer. We expect you to follow basic protocol and professionalism." David's chest tightened. Those words cut like a knife, but he refused to let them wound him. He tried again, pointing at James. He was just standing there, watching people, no basket, no list, looking like he was casing the store. Chloe's eyes met his with a sharpness that sliced through the air. "Do you profile every man buying yogurt?" she retorted. Those words stung more than any response. David flinched, but only for a second. The moment lingered in the silence, now heavier as the eyes of the entire store bore into him. Phones clicked, faces turned. David was no longer just a man in uniform, he was the subject of judgment. James stood still, unmoving, a presence in the storm that had begun to swell. His voice was steady. "You're acting on your own judgment, not a call, not a report. Just a hunch." David's lips twitched, but he didn't respond. He wasn't ready to admit the truth. Not yet. What was his mistake? Where had he gone wrong? A flicker of doubt crept in, but his pride fought back, refusing to yield. David didn't respond. He couldn't. The words hung in the air, like a weight around his neck, pulling him deeper into the silent judgment of the shoppers in the store. The tension was suffocating. This moment was like a mirror, reflecting everything David had built his career on: authority, decisiveness, the sense of always being right. But now, in front of 2 federal agents, that mirror shattered, and what remained was something he couldn't ignore. Behind them, a manager stepped forward, his red polo shirt and thinning hair standing out in the crowd of onlookers. "Everything okay?" the man asked, his tone cautious, his eyes darting between the 2 agents and David. James didn't bother looking at the manager. His response was swift, almost dismissive. "We're fine," he said, his voice unwavering. "No need for you to get involved." David's gaze shifted to the manager, a flicker of desperation in his eyes. "They say they're FBI," he muttered, his voice defensive, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "Can you confirm that?" The manager raised his palms, his expression uncertain. "I don't know who's who, but I saw her before you," he said, pointing at Chloe. "She was near the pharmacy counter, texting and walking like she belonged here." He gestured toward James. "He was here earlier. No trouble. Didn't buy anything. But no trouble either." Those words hit David like a slap to the face. The people around them, the witnesses to this scene, they weren't on his side, they weren't in his corner. And the realization cut through him, sharper than any reprimand. His hand trembled and he crossed his arms, trying to maintain the facade of control. "So where's your suspect?" he asked, attempting to reclaim some authority. His voice was strained, a far cry from the confident, assertive tone he'd used earlier. Chloe didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, scanning the crowd before responding in a calm but firm voice. "Gone. Thanks to you." David wanted to argue, to protest, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he stood there, jaw clenched, fists tight at his sides. The reality of what had just happened weighed on him like a leaden burden. He had failed, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. The silence stretched between them. The normal sounds of the store felt muffled, as if the world had gone quiet in the face of what had transpired. People still moved, but their eyes remained fixed on the scene. Phones were still raised, snapping photos, but no one spoke. Chloe took a breath and glanced at James. David caught the subtle nod, the silent understanding between them. They knew exactly what had happened. He was wrong, and now he would have to live with it. James spoke again, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You can write your report if you want," he said, his tone still calm but with an undercurrent of finality. "We will too. But don't think for a second this ends here." David's hand hovered over his notepad. His pen trembled in his grip, and he fought the urge to slam it down on the counter in frustration. He didn't want to admit he'd misjudged the situation, that his instincts had betrayed him. He didn't want to admit that everything he'd done, all the authority he'd tried to assert, was just a rash reaction to a situation he didn't fully understand. But it was clear, the truth he could no longer avoid. "I want names," David demanded, trying to reassert himself, though his voice was weaker now, less confident. "Full names. I'll write the report. I'll make sure this is documented." James didn't blink. He just looked at David, his gaze steady. "Agent Smith James," he said, his voice firm and cold. "Charlotte Field Office. Want my supervisor's name too?" "4. David scribbled the information, the words on the page like lead weights. His eyes flicked to Chloe, but he said nothing. She gave her name as well, and David wrote it down without further thought. There was no anger left in him, no pride, just a vague acceptance of the reality he'd created. Fort. And then it came, the question he didn't want to ask but couldn't avoid. "Where do we go from here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, unanswered. James's silence was its own response. But Chloe's words cut through the stillness like a sharp blade. "Nothing happens next for you, officer," she said, her voice certain and final. "Not here, not now. This is our case. You interfered. And that's the end of it." David stood there, frozen, unmoving, trying to process everything that had happened. The humiliation, the mistake, the feeling of being caught. Not by a suspect he was trained to spot, but by the very thing he'd trusted. His ego, his sense of control. It was all gone, replaced by something heavier, more suffocating. He didn't know how to respond. His pride was bruised, his authority questioned, and in front of him stood two agents who had done their job quietly, professionally, without a hint of ego or judgment, and they had succeeded where he had failed. David took a deep breath, his chest tightening as he tried to salvage what was left of his dignity. "I didn't mean to mess this up," he muttered, though he knew no one was listening. James's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained clear. "No, you didn't mean to, but you did." And that was the moment David truly understood. His failure wasn't about being wrong. It wasn't about being a bad officer. It was about something deeper, something more personal. The need to control, to assert authority, to always be the one who was right. He had let that need guide him, and in doing so, he had destroyed everything. The crowd had dispersed, their gazes lingering but now shifting elsewhere, phones lowered, their task of capturing the moment complete. The tension had eased, but for David, the silence roared like a deafening noise. He could still feel the weight of those stares. The judgment, the disbelief, the quiet acknowledgement that he had made a mistake. There was no hiding it now. He turned slowly, his eyes flicking toward the automatic doors, the soft hum of the store's ventilation system ringing in his ears as he stepped outside. His footsteps were heavy, as if he were walking through air, each one a reminder of the authority he had once taken for granted, now stripped away. He reached for the door handle, feeling the cold metal under his fingers, but before he could open it, a voice stopped him. Officer David. He didn't need to turn to know it was James, the calm in his voice, the unshakable steadiness. It was the same tone he'd used when their eyes first met. David paused, his hands still on the door, as James's footsteps approached from behind. "Your mistake wasn't that you suspected me," James continued, his voice low but clear. "Your mistake was that you assumed. You didn't ask, you didn't listen." David stood there, his back rigid as the weight of those words began to sink in. He hadn't asked. He hadn't taken the time to understand. He had assumed. He had rushed to a conclusion. James was right. The silence stretched between them, and David felt it seep into his bones. "I didn't mean to mess things up," he said, the words coming out more like a statement than an apology. James let the silence settle before speaking again, his voice not unkind but certain. "The problem with assumptions is they close the door before you know what's behind it." David took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as the reality of the situation continued to sink in. He had walked in with his mind already made up. He had seen a man standing still, and in that stillness he had pinned something suspicious. It was a failure of perception, of judgment. "You'll do better next time," James added, his voice still even. "But the question is, will you?" It wasn't a challenge. Not exactly. It was a simple truth, one David knew deep down but was too proud to admit. David stood at the door, his mind racing. Something stirred within him, a realization that, perhaps for the first time in a long time, he wasn't certain of himself. It was an unfamiliar feeling for someone like him, whose life had been built on certainty. "I won't forget this," David said finally, the words slow, deliberate. "I don't think I can." "No," James replied. "You won't, and that's what matters." Without another word, James turned and walked away, his presence fading into the stillness of the store. David stood there a moment longer, his hand still on the door, as the sound of footsteps receded. He wasn't ready to leave, not yet, but he knew deep down he couldn't stay either. It wasn't until David stepped out into the cool evening air that he fully realized what had happened. The streets were quiet now, the bustle of the day fading as streetlights glowed above him. He walked slowly, each step pulling him further from the man he had been when he entered that store, yet closer to something he didn't yet understand. He didn't know how long he stood there, but when he started walking again, his steps were different, slower, more deliberate. He was still an officer, but for the first time, the weight of that title felt different. It felt like a responsibility, not a privilege. He reached his car and slid into the driver's seat, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as if it could calm the storm within him. The city stretched out before him, and as his headlights illuminated the dark streets, he found himself asking a question he had never dared to consider before. What if he had been wrong all along? The buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. It was a text from his captain, a simple request for the report he had promised to file. David opened the message, his fingers hovering over the screen, but something stopped him. He stared at the blank screen for a moment, the weight of the words still fresh in his mind. This wasn't just about a report. It wasn't just about the mistake he had made in that store. It was about something far bigger, something he would carry with him for a long time. He typed the report, his fingers moving slower than usual. It wasn't about the events. He knew the events. It was about how he saw them, how he told this story. He couldn't just file it away as a minor incident in his career. He couldn't forget the feeling of realizing he was wrong, of being humbled, of the ground beneath him being swept away, and, for the first time in a long time, feeling something like clarity. David finished the report and hit send. His phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't look at it. He didn't need to. The silence around him was no longer oppressive. It had become peaceful. It was a reminder of what was left to learn, and the freedom of admitting you don't have all the answers. As he drove home, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The world outside his car window remained unchanged. But for him there was a shift, something deeper. And maybe, just maybe, that shift would be enough to carry him through the next time he faced a moment of judgment. He wasn't sure. But for the first time he didn't need to be. The days that followed passed strange, as if David were walking through a world that no longer made sense to him. His uniform, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a costume that didn't quite fit. He had always believed the badge brought clarity, that it gave him answers. But now that clarity was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable weight of self-reflection. He found himself replaying the events in his mind, the way his confidence had wavered before James and Chloe, the way his authority had been challenged by the very people he should have trusted. His pride, once a protective shield, had become a burden, and he had seen the damage it caused. His phone buzzed again. Another reminder. His supervisor wanted the full report. A simple task, a straightforward request, but the weight of the words, the responsibility they carried, was no longer just paperwork. It felt like the final step in a process he didn't fully understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that this report wasn't just for his captain. It was for himself, too. That afternoon he sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon light streaming through the window, casting long shadows. His notebook lay open before him, blank. The task was simple, but the words wouldn't come. How do you write something that wasn't just a mistake? How do you explain to someone else the shift that had taken place, within you, the part of you that had always believed in certainty, in being right, only to be undone by something as quiet as another person's gaze? His mind wandered back to the store, to the moment he first saw James, the way the man's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. He had assumed too much, but it wasn't until later, much later, that he realized it wasn't just James watching him. Everyone in the store had been, too. The woman stacking apples, the child in a line at the deli, the manager with thinning hair. They were all silent witnesses to a mistake. Not one of law, not one of the system, but one of a human need to feel superior, to act on judgment without understanding. The report remained blank. David's thoughts turned to the bigger question, the one that had haunted him since he left the store. Why had he reacted that way? Why had he assumed that because James wasn't in uniform he was a threat? Why had his need for control overridden his training, his instincts, his ability to assess a situation calmly? He had been wrong, yes, but it wasn't just that. It was the realization that his actions had been driven by something deeper than just the need to catch a criminal. It was fear, fear of losing control, fear of being wrong, fear of having his authority questioned, fear of not being the one in charge. And that fear had cost him something, not just a suspect, not just the investigation, but his own sense of self. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from his supervisor, a single line. "Let me know when you've submitted the report." David stared at the phone for a moment, then set it down and closed his eyes. It wasn't just about the report, it was about what came next. What would he do with this lesson? A moment of weakness? Would he let it shape him, change him, or would he bury it beneath the armor of certainty that had gotten him into trouble in the first place? He didn't know, but he had to find out. The next morning, David walked into the precinct with a clear purpose. It was a walk he had taken thousands of times before, but today it felt different. He didn't know how it would unfold, but for the first time in a long time, he was open to the possibility that it might be a journey he hadn't anticipated. The squad room buzzed with its usual chaos, phones ringing, officers coming and going, the constant hum of paperwork piling up. But David moved through it like an observer, not entirely part of it, not entirely separate. His eyes scanned the room, his mind elsewhere. He headed toward his desk, but before he could sit down, his captain called out to him. "David, got a minute?" He turned, meeting the stern gaze of Captain Robert. The captain's voice was always steady, but today it carried a weight, as if he knew something David didn't. "Come in," Robert said, gesturing toward his office. David followed the familiar path, feeling strange today, his steps heavy as he entered the captain's office. The door closed behind him, and Robert sat behind his desk, his eyes scanning a sheet of paper in front of him. The silence stretched before them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Robert spoke. "I read your report, David. You did the right thing owning up to your actions." "That's not easy, especially after an incident like that," David nodded, his hands clasped tightly at his sides. "I messed up, sir." Robert's gaze softened. "We all mess up, but that's not the point here. The point is, what are you going to do with it?" David looked up, his eyes meeting the captain's. He felt the weight of that question, the one that had haunted him for days. "I don't know, sir," he admitted. "I don't know what happens next." Robert leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "The next step is simple, David. You learn from this, you find a way to do better, and then you move forward." The words were simple, but David understood them in a way he never had before. There was no magic fix, no quick solution. It was a process, a slow, uncomfortable one. "Look," Robert continued, his voice softening, "this job isn't just about catching criminals. It's about understanding people, seeing beyond the badge, beyond the uniform. And when you stop seeing people for who they really are, that's when you lose yourself. That's when mistakes happen." David swallowed hard. "I didn't see him. I didn't see who James was. I just saw him as an obstacle." Robert nodded slowly. "Exactly. And that's the part you need to fix. Because the badge is only part of who you are. The real work is understanding why you do what you do, and then doing it better." David felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a sudden change, not a moment of epiphany, but it was enough to make him realize that the path forward wasn't about reclaiming his authority, not about going back to what he had before. It was about understanding himself, his capacity to fail, and his willingness to learn from that failure. As he left the captain's office, David didn't feel lighter, but he felt different. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it, not as the officer he thought he should be, but as a man who had learned a lesson he would never forget. The following days passed in a blur of routine, but David felt a shift within himself. The same precinct, the same faces, the same service calls, but now he approached them with a different mindset. Every interaction, every report, every case felt more profound than before. He wasn't just solving crimes, he was seeking understanding of the people he was meant to protect, of the criminals he was meant to stop, and, most importantly, of himself. It wasn't easy. Old habits crept in, the instinct to act decisively, the tendency to assert his authority without fully understanding the situation. But each time those habits surfaced, David caught himself. He took a breath. He paused. He had learned that nothing in his job or in his life was as simple as he once thought. Every decision now carried weight. Every word had consequences, and he had to think about them all. He could no longer act on instinct or snap judgments alone. The world was too complex, too full of nuance for that. But even as David tried to embrace this new mindset, the shadows of his past actions loomed over him. He hadn't forgotten the grocery store, the way everything had gone wrong, the way he had failed not just in his job, but in the most fundamental way, by refusing to see things as they truly were. Then, as David sat at his desk one late night, sorting through the latest reports, where the weight of the lesson truly began to sink in, his phone buzzed on the desk, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. He hesitated, then answered, "Officer David?" The voice on the other end was calm, almost emotionless. "This is Agent Chloe. Agent Sienna Chloe. We need to talk." David's chest tightened, the unexpected call catching him off guard. Agent Chloe, what's this about? A pause on the other end, as if she were considering her next words carefully. I've been briefed on your report. Your captain forwarded it to me. We need to clear up some things regarding the incident at Hensley's Market. The mention of it hit like a jolt, a vivid reminder of the tension, the uncertainty, and the failure he had experienced. He had hoped it would fade, but the reality was that it wasn't something that could simply disappear. He had learned a lesson the hard way, and now the consequences would unfold in ways he hadn't anticipated. Sure, David replied, his voice tense. What's this about? Chloe's voice remained steady as ever. We reviewed the footage from that day, and there are some things we need to discuss with you, specifically about how you approached the suspect. David's stomach sank. What do you mean? His voice betrayed his uncertainty. He already knew he had been wrong, but hearing it spelled out by someone so calm, so clear, made it all the more real. Chloe didn't sugarcoat it. We don't typically confront people without understanding the context. In your case, you walked in with assumptions, and that caused problems for us. The situation escalated unnecessarily. There are consequences to how we interact with suspects, especially when we're dealing with a federal investigation. Your actions interfered with a case we'd been tracking for months, David nodded, though Chloe couldn't see. His pride took another hit, but this time he didn't recoil. The lesson had been learned, and now he had to take responsibility for it. The truth hurt, but it was necessary. He had to face it head on. I understand, David said, his voice softer, the arrogance from before replaced by a humility he hadn't known he possessed. I didn't think about how my actions would affect the investigation. I saw something and acted without thinking. Chloe's tone softened slightly. It's not about what you saw, David. It's about how you handled it, how we handle situations, how we approach people. That's what defines us as officers. You need to think before you act, not just in terms of the law, but in terms of understanding people. It's easy to let instinct guide you, but it's the moments when you pause, when you reflect, that make the difference. David exhaled slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she was right. He had acted out of ego, out of fear, not out of understanding, and now he would have to rebuild from there. Chloe continued, We're not holding you accountable for everything, David, but you need to know that how you act, how you think, affects more than just your career. It affects people's lives. The call ended, and David sat back in the dimly lit room, the phone still pressed to his ear long after the connection had dropped. He could hear the soft hum of the precinct in the background, but his mind was elsewhere. He had no more excuses, no more justifications. He was alone with the truth. He had failed, yes, but this was his chance to do better. And for the first time in weeks, David felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He would have to rebuild his reputation, regain the trust of his colleagues, and, perhaps more importantly, of himself. But he knew it was part of the journey, the path to understanding, to becoming better. That evening, David stood at his apartment window, looking out over the city. The lights below twinkled, small and distant, but they were a reminder that the world was vast, full of complexity and nuance. There was so much to understand about the world, about others, and about himself. He had made a mistake, but he was ready to move past it. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. He would learn from his failures, grow from them, and ensure that, next time, he would be the officer he knew he could be. The path ahead wasn't clear, but it was his. One step at a time. David didn't sleep much that night. The gentle hum of the city outside his window felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else, not to an officer still grappling with his own actions. He had spent years building confidence, the invincibility that the badge brought, the weight of authority, and now, in just a few moments, it had all crumbled. The call with Agent Chloe still echoed in his mind, a cold truth in her words, cutting through his defenses like a knife. He had wanted to deny, to explain himself, to justify his actions, But there was no justification. His actions had spoken louder than any words. He had acted on instinct, yes, but that instinct had been fueled by pride and a fear of being seen as weak. And in the end, it was his weakness, his inability to see beyond his own assumptions, that had brought everything crashing. The next morning, David walked into the precinct with a new resolve. The entire day felt different. He was different. He had never been one to admit fault easily. But now, he realized that the humility forced upon him the previous day was starting to shape him in ways he hadn't expected. His desk was still cluttered with paperwork, cases, and reports awaiting his attention. But as he sat down, his mind kept returning to the moment at Hensley's Market. The way James had stood there, calm and steady, while he floundered, trying to seize control. The way Chloe had cut through his defenses like a hot knife, reminding him that law enforcement wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about understanding people, reading them, knowing when to speak and when to listen. He had been so certain before, so confident in himself. But that certainty had turned out to be a trap. David rubbed his temples, the weight of everything settling heavily on his chest. He didn't want to be the officer remembered for his mistakes. He didn't want to be the one who lost a case because of a hunch. But he was starting to realize that, in some ways, this failure was the key to moving forward. It was the awareness of his own fallibility that would make him a better officer, a better person. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from his supervisor. Meeting in minutes. We need to go over your report. David sighed, his stomach twisting at the thought. He had written the report honestly. He had laid out everything as it happened. But now, the idea of revisiting the incident, of discussing his failure in front of others, felt like yet another hurdle he had to face. As he stepped into the captain's office, he noticed that the usual tension was absent. Captain Robert was calm, his posture relaxed, but there was something different in the air, a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. Perhaps it was the way Robert had spoken to him earlier that week, or maybe it was simply the realization that everyone, even the captain, had their moments of weakness. David, Robert greeted him with a nod, motioning for him to sit. I've read your report. I know it wasn't easy to write, but you did the right thing by owning up to what happened. David nodded, his hands resting on his lap, fingers gripping the edge of his notebook. He was ready for whatever came next. He had accepted the consequences in his mind. That said, Robert continued, his voice steady but not harsh, this isn't the end of the road. We all make mistakes. The question now is what you do with it. How do you move forward? David looked up at the captain, the weight of his words sinking in. I'm ready to do whatever it takes, sir. The captain leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. Good. We've got a lot of work ahead. The department, your colleagues, they need to know you're not just taking responsibility. They need to see that you're changing, that you're learning from this. And that's going to take time. It's going to take effort. David swallowed hard. He had never been one for the easy path, but this felt like an entirely new challenge, one he wasn't sure he was ready for. But that uncertainty didn't scare him anymore. In fact, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could truly grow. I'll do whatever I can, David said, his voice quiet but resolute. I don't want to let anyone down again. Robert nodded slowly. Good. We'll start by making sure this doesn't impact your next cases. I know it's tough, but we'll get you back on track. One step at a time. David left the captain's office feeling far lighter than he had in days. The weight of his mistakes hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt suffocating. He knew he had to earn back the trust of his team, of those who believed in him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he understood that the path forward wasn't about proving his authority or reclaiming his pride. It was about listening, about understanding, and learning to see the world through a lens of humility. As he walked through the precinct, his steps were lighter, more deliberate. He wasn't the officer he had been before. He was no longer the man who assumed he knew everything. He was someone new, someone who had seen the cracks in his own armor and had begun to mend them, slowly, piece by piece. David wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time he was okay with that. He was no longer afraid of the unknown, because he knew that, whatever came next, he would face it with a new sense of understanding. And that was all he could ask for. As he sat back at his desk, ready to dive back into his work, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He would do better. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. This was the moment everything changed. David spent the next few weeks with his head down, focusing on his work, trying to apply the lessons he had learned to reality. His desk became a sanctuary, the pile of reports and cases a way for him to regain control. Not over others, but over himself. He was no longer just an officer in uniform. He was a man undergoing a quiet but profound transformation, striving to become someone who could see beyond assumptions and his own ego. The precinct, buzzing with its usual noise, felt different now. The conversations among colleagues seemed louder, clearer. But David no longer heard the surface noise. His ears had tuned to the subtleties, the pauses, the hesitations in conversations. He was learning to read people, not just through what they said, but through what they didn't say. His supervisor, Captain Robert, noticed the change in him too. David was no longer just following orders. He was thinking before acting, weighing every option with a care he had never shown before. The confidence that had once defined him had been replaced by introspection, a humility he had paid a steep price to gain, but one that was invaluable. One day, a few weeks after the incident at Hensley's Market, David faced another situation that, in the past, might have easily fallen into his old pattern of instinctive judgment. He was called to the scene of a break-in at a local electronics store. The suspect had been detained by a store security guard and was being held in the back, awaiting David's arrival. When he arrived, the familiar rush of adrenaline coursed through him, but this time it felt different. He didn't rush to be the hero. He didn't charge toward the suspect to assert his authority. Instead, David paused at the door, his hand on the handle, taking a deep breath. Inside, the suspect sat on a chair, arms crossed over his chest, eyes darting around nervously as the security guard stood nearby. The man didn't seem dangerous, but that wasn't why David hesitated. The old David would have assumed guilt and acted without thinking, but now he was taking his time. He was looking for something more, something beyond the surface. "Hey," David said, his voice steady as he stepped into the room. "What happened here?" The suspect didn't shrink back. Instead, he looked up, his eyes filled with frustration and fear. "I didn't do anything," the man said, his voice trembling but defensive. "I was just looking around. I didn't take anything." David tilted his head slightly, his mind assessing the situation. He felt the old instinct to act, to assert control, but he pushed it down. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to understand. "I'm not sure about that," David replied calmly, his tone neutral. "But I want to hear your story. Let's talk." For a moment, the man stared at David, as if unsure how to respond. Then, in a softer voice, he began to explain. He was looking for a new phone, had seen a sale sign in the window, and had simply come in to browse. He had made a mistake, but he hadn't stolen anything. As David listened, he realized the man wasn't lying. There was no guilt in his voice, no defensive posture screaming caught red-handed. The security guard, on the other hand, seemed eager to pin blame, his eyes full of suspicion, arms tightly crossed. David glanced at the guard, then back at the suspect. "Why don't we review the security footage? It'll help clear things up." The guard seemed irritated, but David's calm demeanor left no room for escalation. The suspect, still nervous, nodded in agreement. David led them to the back office, where the footage was reviewed. Sure enough, the video confirmed the suspect's story. He had indeed walked in, looked around, and left without taking anything. The store manager was called in to review the footage, and with a quick glance, he confirmed the same. "No crime here," he said with a sigh. "Sorry for the inconvenience. We'll let him go." David nodded, but there was something more. As he escorted the suspect out, he offered a quiet piece of advice. "Next time, maybe check with the store security before stepping in. People can get the wrong idea." The man looked at David, surprised by the kindness in his tone. "Thanks, officer," he said, his voice softer. "Now, I didn't mean to cause any trouble." David watched him leave, his gaze lingering on the door as it closed. It was a small matter, just a moment in an ordinary day. But for David, it felt like a turning point. He had handled the situation with patience, understanding, and the professionalism he had learned in the weeks since that day at the grocery store. He was no longer the same officer. He was no longer the man who rushed in, eager to assert authority. He was learning to pause, to listen, to see the humanity in everyone he encountered. And in doing so, he was finally beginning to earn back the respect of his colleagues, and perhaps, just perhaps, his own respect too. The change didn't come all at once. It wasn't a grand revelation. It wasn't a moment of epiphany. It was a slow, steady, a gradual shift from a man who wore authority like armor to one who carried understanding like a second skin. As he sat at his desk at the end of that day, David realized how far he had come in such a short time. To reclaim what he had lost, but to move forward, to learn to accept that mistakes weren't the end, but the beginning of something new, something better. He still had a long road ahead. There were still cases to solve, people to protect, and lessons to learn. But for the first time, David felt ready. Ready to step into the unknown, ready to face uncertainty with a new perspective, and above all, ready to be the officer he had always wanted to be. Not just the one who acted, but the one who understood. And in that quiet, steady acceptance, David found peace. The peace that came from knowing that true growth wasn't about fixing mistakes. It was about understanding them, and through them, understanding himself. Day after day, weeks had passed since that incident, and David felt a slow but undeniable shift in every interaction. His work, once a relentless whirlwind, now carried a quiet purpose. Each case, no matter how small, became an opportunity, not just to enforce the law, but to listen, to learn, and to grow. His colleagues began to notice the change, though it wasn't a dramatic transformation marked by grand gestures. David was no longer the officer who rushed into situations fueled by adrenaline and a need to be the center of attention. Instead, he was the one who took a moment to listen, to ask questions, to truly hear what others had to say before drawing conclusions. It wasn't easy. He still grappled with the instinct to fall back into old habits, to assume, to react. But every time he caught himself, he remembered the lessons carved out of the biggest mistake of his life. The grocery store, the confrontation with James and Chloe, had broken him in a way nothing else could. It showed him the cost of acting without understanding, of letting his ego lead. But it wasn't just his colleagues who noticed the change. The community did too. David had always taken pride in his work, in his ability to be a protector, a leader. But now, his pride wasn't in his authority. It wasn't in the uniform he wore or the badge on his chest. It was in the way people looked at him, not as a symbol of power, but as a person they could trust. Someone who didn't just enforce the law, but embodied it through empathy and understanding. The real test came on a cool autumn evening when David received a call about a domestic disturbance. It was a situation he had handled countless times before, but this time something felt different. The urgency in the dispatcher's voice was sharp, the details vague. David didn't rush to conclusions. He didn't assume. Instead, he focused on the information he had, keeping his mind clear, his actions measured. When he arrived at the house, a small single-story home in a quiet neighborhood, the tension inside was palpable. The front door was slightly ajar, and through the small window in the door, David could see a man pacing. The woman who had called Jubaiti sat on the couch, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. David took a deep breath. He was no longer the officer who would barge in, hand on his holster, demanding answers. He was different now. He was the officer who understood the weight of his actions, who knew that every situation required a careful approach. He knocked on the door, his hand steady, his presence calm. The man inside didn't flinch. He didn't yell or threaten. He just looked at David with tired, frustrated eyes. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, his voice laced with anger, but something else too, something David couldn't quite place. "I'm here to make sure everyone's okay," David said, his voice steady but approachable. "I just want to talk." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped back, allowing David to enter. David sensed the man's tension, but he didn't rush. He waited for the space to open, for the moment when a conversation could begin, not with an accusation, but with a question. David turned to the woman on the couch, her hands trembling. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. The woman nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. She looked at David, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. "He didn't mean it," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He gets angry, but he doesn't mean to hurt me," David nodded, taking in her words. He knew this wasn't just a simple argument. It was deeper, more complex. He turned to the man, who still stood by the door, his posture defensive. "What happened tonight?" David asked, his voice calm but probing. The man shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice rising slightly. She provokes me, officer. She always does." David didn't react to the accusation. Instead, he stood there, watching the man, letting the silence stretch, letting him feel the weight of the moment. He didn't rush to accuse. He didn't try to force a confession. He simply listened, and in that listening, the man seemed to soften. "I don't know what to do anymore," the man said finally, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with him. "I don't want this. I don't want to hurt her, but I don't know how to stop." David took a step closer, but not aggressively. He didn't reach for handcuffs or raise his voice. He simply said softly, with a presence driven not by authority but by understanding, "It's okay to ask for help. You don't have to do this alone." The man's eyes flickered, a mix of shame and relief crossing his face. David didn't need to say more. The man was no longer the same person David had met when he walked into the room. He was softer, and so was the atmosphere. In the end, David called in the necessary resources to support the family. The man wasn't arrested. Instead, he was offered the help he needed: counseling, anger management, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. The woman was provided with resources too, a way out of the cycle of violence that had enveloped her life. As David left the house that night, he felt a sense of peace, not because of the case, the paperwork, or even the outcome itself, but because he knew, in that moment, he had been the officer he always wanted to be, not the one wielding power and control, but the one who understood, who listened, and who made a difference in the quietest, most meaningful ways. The streets outside were calm, the cool air filling his lungs as he walked to his car. He heard the distant hum of traffic, the familiar sounds of the city, but they didn't feel the same anymore. The world wasn't just cases and situations. It was a web of people, each with their own stories, their own struggles. And David was no longer an observer, standing on the outside. He was part of it, part of the understanding, the listening, the growth. The weight of his badge felt different now, lighter somehow. It wasn't just a piece of metal marking him as an officer. It was a reminder of everything he had learned, everything he had overcome, and everything he had yet to become. And for the first time in a long time, David felt a peace, not because the world was perfect, but because he had finally found his place in it. Thank you for watching this story on Shoe Stories. If it moved you, taught you something, or made you rethink the meaning of silence, Please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your voice matters. Let it be heard quietly or loudly, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos showing on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity, justice, and unexpected. We'll see you in the next one.